Hello and welcome to the course Social Behavior and the Brain, an introduction to social neuroscience. I am Dr. Ark Verma, an associate professor in the Department of Cognitive Science at IIT Kanpur. This is week 2 and we are in the lecture 7 of this week. Now, we have so far seen this meta-analysis that the authors Zaki and Oshner did, wherein they were basically aggregating a bunch of different kinds of studies in a 2x2 sort of format. So, they were looking at either direct processing or reflective processing, and they are looking at either the self as a target or the other as a target. And they basically looked at a bunch of dependent variables in question, where they were looking at emotions, traits, personality judgments, mental states, attributions, and so on. Now, on the basis of that, we saw a bunch of things. We saw that there is certainly a large degree of overlap between areas of the brain involved when you are processing the affective states in self and in the others. But this processing is moderated by the task demands, it is moderated by the mode of processing that is invoked, and it is basically also regulated by this information that is spontaneously gained about the mental states and intentions of others. Now, from this lecture, we are starting to evaluate another kind of stimulus, another kind of studies where we are going to be talking about how do we retrieve personal knowledge about others. So, when you are looking at others, let us say another person's picture or their faces, or say for example vignette about them, how do you retrieve information about them? How do you interact with familiar people versus people who you are not familiar to? For example, you are out there in the shopping mall, you are looking for something and you ran into a friend. How do you react then versus how do you react when you are seeing thousands of other faces who you do not really know about? So, let us dive straight into it and let us try and understand how things are done with respect to retrieving personal knowledge, retrieving knowledge about familiar people as well as unfamiliar people. Now, let us start with this. The first piece of socially relevant information that we obtain about the other individuals is basically from viewing their faces. When you are looking at somebody, when you meet them first time, you are trying to look at their faces, trying to decipher, oh, whether this person is happy or not happy seeing me, what is this person's intentions, are they thinking to genuinely meet us, genuinely congratulate us, or they are have some other ulterior motivations behind their face. So, the face therefore becomes our entry point into the mental life of the other individual, and that is why it is a very special stimulus, it is a very important stimulus. And there is a very interesting observation by Leslie Brothers who says that the face is a special stimulus. It is a special stimulus because it is processed immediately and obligatorily converted into the representation of the person who the face belongs to even before reaching awareness. So, it is not like sometimes you will hear people saying that, oh, I am getting good vibes from you, oh, the energy around this person is great, oh, the energy around this person is not great. Now, again, I do not want to comment on the other aspects of what goes on in these kind of decisions, but certainly one very important aspect of these kind of decisions is how are you or what is the impression that you are forming of this other individual in question. Are you able to judge even before this has come to your awareness? Are you able to judge whether this particular individual bears good thoughts for you or negative thoughts for you? Whether this person is a kind individual at heart or is a mean person, and the interaction is basically a manipulated interaction or not. So, these are some of the things that are automatically, remember, face is a very special stimulus, it is a socially relevant stimulus, and evolutionarily also it carries a lot of weight. We look at each other, we derive each other's intentions, we decide to whether to work in cooperation or to not work in cooperation based on other than words, just the face of the individual and their body language, to basically estimate what they are feeling, whether they are saying correct things, true things or not. So, this is a very interesting thing because just like words, for example, you do not have the choice to not read a word. You do not have the choice to not read a word. If I show you a word, you can see on the screen, you cannot want to, or you cannot voluntarily decide against reading a word. If you know English and I have written here CAMEL, camel, you will immediately read it. There is no, it is not a voluntary process. Similarly, encoding or decoding information that is embedded in a face is a voluntary act, is an involuntary act. You do not need to decide, oh, let me process or not process this face. You will automatically do it, and you will have a sense of what the person is about, even once having the first interaction with this individual. There is also a very interesting point made by I think Marcel Proust in one of these quotations. So they have appreciated that viewing a person's face can be seen as akin to a very intellectual process. It requires us to process the information that is embedded there in the face in great detail. For example, and there are so many attributes. There is the physical outline of that individual, our impression about that individual, and our overall image of the individual. Whether you like the person or not. You've many times might have heard of things like love at first sight, infatuation, attraction with certain people, and sometimes you will have without even a fault of the other person, a bit of a repelling feeling about the others. Maybe you're not interpreting their intentions correctly, maybe you are misinterpreting their thoughts and so on. But it is again something of an intellectual act, in the sense that you have to necessarily try and decode the information that is being provided to you in the face of the individual you are interacting with. And all of this sort of blends into the physical features of the face as well. So for example, people who you think have good intentions for you, or like you, or have positive feelings and thoughts about you, you will automatically have more positive judgment about their face. Say for example, you might be inclined to say, oh, I think that this person is extremely beautiful, or I think that person's face is extremely likable, whereas people you don't like, people you know that are, let's say, not good people, or they've done something bad to you in the past, sometimes you will even stop liking their face as well. Say, oh, when I see that face, it sort of does not give me the correct vibes, there is a lot of negative energy about this individual and so on. Those kind of metaphors are typically used based on your first phenomenal sort of judgment about an individual's face. So again, face seems to be a very, very important stimulus that we process almost nonchalantly. So in this lecture, we are going to try and study how faces, or what in what way we process faces in some detail. So yes, face perception plays a very important and a multidimensional role in social communication. It seems to be mediated by a distributed neural system that includes a number of regions of the brain, including face selective regions in the extrastriate visual cortex, which is designated as the core system, and regions linked with other contingent functions such as emotions, action comprehension, and person information. So again, when you are looking at a face, there is the initial low level judgments that will be required, but then there are also cognitive judgments, intellectual judgments that you will be making about the face, and therefore there will be other regions of the brain, more cognitively relevant regions of the brain, which will make these decisions for you. Now, in humans and other primates, the neuroimaging of the brain in response to faces has been compared to other categories of objects, and it has repeatedly implicated areas that show a stronger response to faces in comparison to, let's say, other kinds of stimuli like words or houses or other objects and so on. So it seems that the face, being a very socially relevant and something that we must have evolutionarily learned, since that it is a very important stimulus for us, there seem to be regions of the brain that are tuned to particularly respond to faces, give a stronger response to face stimuli as compared to other kinds of stimuli. Now, what are these areas? Let's look at that. More specifically, in humans, the most important area implicated in face perception is the lateral fusiform gyrus, which was also given the name the fusiform face area by Canvisher in his 1997 paper. Now, this fusiform face area has been deemed as a specialized module for perception of faces, and that it is specialized or not is sort of has been debated widely. So there is again a large number of researchers which deem it the fusiform face area, much like Fodor's module for face perception. But there are also other arguments about the same, which are, for example, other accounts such as the distributed object form topography hypothesis. It states that faces and different categories of objects are represented by distributed and overlapping patterns of responses in the ventral temporal cortex. So it seems, so the distributed object form topography basically says that it's not only the fusiform face area, but a distributed bunch of regions which give overlapping pattern of responses, and these regions are supposed to be found in the ventral temporal cortex. There is another hypothesis called the expert visual recognition hypothesis, which also proposes that the stronger response in the fusiform face area might be driven by expertise, over familiarity. We have been seeing faces for millions and billions of years, and it is this expertise that is encoded in our brain, and it is not it's not a special property of the face to be processed as such. It is because we have been processing faces for so long, the brain has evolved into creating or dedicating these special regions for processing the face. Again, whatever there might be, let's get into seeing how face processing is actually achieved, because along with the fusiform face area, there are other regions also which have been implicated by neuroimaging studies wherein participants were looking at faces. For example, fMRI studies have demonstrated that other areas also respond selectively more to faces as compared to other objects, such as the inferior occipital gyrus, the OFA, and the posterior superior temporal sulcus, which is the PSTS. Also, areas that are involved in cognitive functions such as other than face perception, such as in emotion recognition or social cognition, are also supposed to be involved in perception of faces. So, based on these observations, based on observation of a large number of regions implicated in face processing, Haxby, Hoffman and Gobini proposed a model for face perception, which was inspired by a cognitive model earlier proposed by Bruce and Young in 1986. Let's look at this model. This is the model. You can see this seems to be the core system, whereas this seems to be the extended system. In the core system, you can see that there is the inferior occipital gyrus, the OFA, which is involved in the early perception of facial features. So, whether the face is symmetrical or not, what is the complexion of the face, and so many other things. On the other hand, there is the superior temporal sulcus, this region here. It is involved in encoding face movement and changeable aspects of face. So, when I am talking to you, my mouth is moving, my eyes are moving, I am sort of also changing my expressions every now and then, and these are supposed to be the dynamic features of face perception that seem to be mediated by the superior temporal sulcus. The third region, which is actually your fusiform face area or the lateral fusiform gyrus, it seems to be encoding the invariant aspects of faces for perceptions of unique identity. Say for example, my face versus somebody else's face versus let's say your parents or your friends or your partner's face, those kind of invariant features of face. Say for example, there will be specific or unique markers on my face that will help you recognize me and differentiate or discriminate me from, let's say, another face that you are just seeing. So that part seems to be mediated by the lateral fusiform gyrus or the fusiform face area. So this here seems to be the core system. Then there is this other slightly extended system which basically might be getting recruited depending upon the task that we are asking our participants to do with as far as the faces are concerned. What are the regions here? The intraparietal sulcus, the precuneus, the superior temporal gyrus, the amygdala, the anterior temporal region, the superior temporal sulcus, the anterior paracingulate, and so on. And you can see here also that all of these faces are, all of these regions of the brain are supposed to be recruited in specific functions. So for example, the IPS is recruited in spatial attention, the precuneus in retrieval of long term images. So for example, if you are looking at a face, you are recognizing, oh, this is my friend from school, I have not met him from the past 5-6 years, and but suddenly when you see them, all the memories and experiences with that person come back rushingly to you. Then there is the superior temporal gyrus, which basically links the face to the voice, the amygdala, which helps you judge the emotion on somebody's face, the anterior temporal cortex, which basically also has biographical knowledge, related to the face, so all person knowledge there. The superior temporal sulcus, very important in judging the intentions of others, whether I want to be friends with this person or just stay away. And then there is the anterior paracingulate cortex, which is involved in the theory of mind and judging of the personal attributes of others. So again, this is just a brief sort of overview. Let's dive in more detail and understand what these regions might be doing. So, a bit of a repetition, I think, the next few slides, but please pay attention. So, it seems, according to this model, that face perception is mediated by spatially distributed processes across different regions of the brain. The model divides the regions responding to the faces into two types of systems. You just saw the core system, which has 3 areas, and the extended system, which has a bunch of other regions. So, this core system seems to include the fusiform face area, the inferior occipital gyrus, and the posterior superior temporal sulcus. And this is supposed to encode the visual appearance of a face, the first parts, the first steps in processing a face. The FFA and the PSTS are proposed to mediate the encoding of 2 broad classes of visual information about the appearance of the faces. So, the dynamic features and the invariant features, and so that is that. Yeah, I just mentioned it. So, on the other hand, there is this extended system. The extended system has been proposed to be recruited in concert with these other areas within the areas of the core system, and to process information conveyed by a face, such as biographical information, direction of attention, emotion, intentions, and so on and so forth. Again, remember, the recruitment of the areas in the extended system will basically be rather task dependent or context dependent. When you are just meeting and trying to recognize a person versus when you are trying to really get into a collaboration and you really need to sort of understand what is this person about, and you are consciously reflecting on the person's identity. Now, let us take this a little bit further. I said in the beginning that there is supposedly a difference in 2 things. When you are meeting familiar individuals, when you are looking at familiar faces, versus when you are watching faces of people you have no idea about. So, looking at familiar faces versus looking at unfamiliar faces, there seem to be cognitive differences, neural differences, and let us observe them going forward. So, meeting someone we know starts an interesting chain of events which involves activating and bringing into awareness all the information that we have about this individual, our past experiences, and our overall impression of that person. fMRI research on familiar face recognition has focused mostly on the fusiform gyrus and the anterior temporal regions. Fusiform gyrus, anterior temporal region. However, the modulation of responses to the faces in fusiform gyrus has sort of, at least based on familiarity, has not yielded very consistent results. So, different studies have come up with different kinds of insights about how the fusiform gyrus might be involved in looking at familiar faces, which seems a bit counterintuitive because it is a key area in the brain, and so people have wondered as to why these inconsistent findings have been reported. So, let us look at this in some detail. So, the anterior temporal cortex has shown, on the other hand, we will talk about the inconsistent results in the FFA in a bit. Now, on the other hand, the anterior temporal cortex has been shown to display stronger activation for a variety of familiar as compared to unfamiliar stimuli, such as names, familiar landscapes, and familiar faces. It implies that this area, the anterior temporal cortex, may be playing a very important role in the retrieval of biographical or autobiographical information about the faces that you are seeing. Now, coming back to this point of inconsistent findings with the fusiform gyrus, different explanations have been offered. Let us go through them one by one. Now, for the first part, it has been opined that different experiments have used different types of familiar faces. For example, some studies have used famous familiar faces. So, for example, pictures of Bollywood personalities or cricketers or other kinds of sports that you might be involved in, politicians for that matter, whereas some studies have used faces of acquaintances. So, for example, faces of relatives, friends from college, and so on. And in other case, people have sort of induced familiarity just in an experimental setup. You get the participant, you give them some behavioral training that you look at these 5 people or 10 people, this person's name is this, he does this, the qualities are this, and you sort of give them this behavioral training for let us say half an hour, 1 hour, and so on, and then you get the participant into the scanner using watching these faces versus another class of faces. So what seems to be happening here, what seems to be the problem here is that these studies that are trying to study the perception of familiar faces seem to have used faces that could be characterized by different types of familiarity. Remember, the type of familiarity that you will have with a Bollywood personality or a cricketer personality or a political personality will be very different than the kind of familiarity you will have with, let's say, your family members, and it will also be different with the kind of familiarity you will have with your friends. It will also be different with the kind of familiarity that you with faces that you have just seen while walking into the experimental lab. So obviously, remember what we have been repeating through and through is that the human brain is extremely sensitive to context. The human the way the brain sort of acts, the way the brain recruits specific regions across the brain for specific tasks, it is A, very sensitive to context, it is B, very sensitive to task demands, it is C, very sensitive to the exact dimensions in which the stimuli in question are differing from one another. So you might be giving faces as a target for perception, but if the faces are differing from each other in critical dimensions, then obviously the way the fusiform gyrus, for example, will react will be different, and that is probably one of the important reasons for the inconsistency that is being reported in literature with respect to watching familiar faces. There are other possible reasons as well. For example, different experiments have been found to utilize tasks that have placed different demands on attentional resources. For example, recognition of a familiar individual goes beyond the visual representation of that person's face, and it is therefore possible that the fusiform face area may be influenced by top-down modulation from the areas of the extended system. Now remember, the areas of the extended system are involved in paying attention, in inferring emotion, inferring mental states, inferring intentions, and so many other things. Now if you are watching the face of a familiar individual, suppose you are watching the face of a close family member who you've had a really bad fight with in the last week or so. When you're watching that face, what are the emotions that are going to come? When you are watching, say for example, when you are watching that face, it is not only the the peripheral or the superficial visual analysis that will take place. It will basically bring to you, as I said earlier, a huge amount of data. It will bring to you the intention of the person, how the person has been behaving in the past, your impression of the person, which is also rather dynamic, I must say. So again, as I have been saying, different kinds of experiments, if they are placing different kinds of demands on the individual person, then obviously the kind of activity that will be observed in the regions of the brain can be expected to be different, which probably is causing some confusion amongst researchers. Also, social psychological researchers have provided evidence for the automatic activation of traits and attitudes associated with perceived individuals. So when you are perceiving the attitudes amongst individuals, so the representation of significant others is found to be richer in terms of their thoughts, their feelings, emotions, as compared to the representation of non-significant others. For example, you are watching the picture of your parent, your mother or your father, of your sibling, your brother, your sister, of your partner, for example, or when you are watching at looking at the pictures of people who don't matter that much to you, or people who you are not intimately familiar with. When you are watching pictures of people who you are intimately familiar with, who you exactly know as family members and so on, will bring an activation of the thoughts related to that person, the feelings related to that person, the emotions that these people evoke, versus if you are just watching a picture of a random stranger, obviously all of that rich information is not there. Since that rich information and since that overlearned context is not there, obviously the regions of the brain will respond differently, and which is what we see happening. Gradually, as people become more familiar with these other individuals, the inferences made about these individuals will gradually get more related to psychologically mediated variables such as goals and beliefs. Oh, I know this is my teacher, this is my student, this is my friend, and so on. And to a lesser extent to broad uncontextualized traits such as, oh, it seems this guy seems aggressive or this guy seems friendly. You will see a lot of times people look at somebody's face and they say, oh, this guy has a mean face, seems to be very competitive, seems to be very rude. Oh, if you don't know that person, if you don't have actual knowledge about that person's ambitions, mental states and so on, it is probably not correct to make judgments about how they, what they might be feeling. Once you know the person better, you say, oh, I used to think that this person is a very rude guy, but it is just that he is slightly introverted or she is slightly introverted and does not, open up very easily. So, the degree of familiarity one has with the face in question, the type of familiarity one has with the face in question will evoke different kinds of knowledge about this individual that you will bring into play, and accordingly your judgments about the person, your overall impression about the person, your evaluation about the person, and the neural regions involved in watching these other people's face will change accordingly. Now, the authors actually, to basically investigate or to distinguish between these type of familiar faces, they designed 3 fMRI experiments, and obviously there were different participants in these 3 experiments, and everybody just had to do this one back repetition detection task based on face identity. So, a series of faces will come, they have to remember the face which came just before the face in question. So, one back repetition, you basically have to judge the identity, the consecutive images, first face, and so this is F1 and this another trial F1 is coming. So, your consecutive pictures of the same person would come, but there will be different images of this person, so that you are just focusing on the face and not the visual characteristics of the stimulus in question. Okay. So, the task was based on the perceptual characteristics of these faces and did not really require the participant to pay attention to the person knowledge about these target faces to begin with. One of the aims of the task that I just described, which is the same in 3 experiments, was to induce equal attention to all stimuli without the explicit retrieval of information about the person. Hence, any effect of familiarity that you now see would depend, basically will signal the spontaneous retrieval of person knowledge. When you see a face, you remember everything about the person spontaneously. It is nothing in the picture itself that is asking you to do that. So, let us dive into this a little bit more detail. These 3 experiments I will discuss in this lecture to relatively lesser depth, but in the next lecture I will talk in much more detail about these 3 experiments as well. So, the 3 experiments just mentioned sought to explore different aspects of face familiarity. For example, in the first 2 studies, the authors investigated familiarity that accrues naturally with years of exposure and social interactions, whereas the third experiment was designed as a control study for the first 2 studies to isolate the role of visual familiarity versus actual abstract familiarity from the role of person knowledge during face recognition. So, what is happening? In the first 2 experiment, there are 2 kinds of familiarity that are being seen. In one, they are actually seeing pictures of family members. I will describe this in more detail when we go ahead, but at this point just remember the first 2 experiment had naturally accruing familiarity. So, people that you know from a long time, either through intimate personal contact, pictures of family members, or through a lot of mention in news and so on. Say for example, famous people, Bollywood, politics, cricket, anybody who is more famous and you see their pictures virally trending on your social media, those kind of pictures. And in the third study, the familiarity is experimentally introduced by behavioral training that the participants received just before the main experiment began. So, you were shown a specific number of pictures, you have said, oh, this picture is Rajesh, this is Ramesh, this is Riya, these are the characteristics of these individuals and so on, but this is something that has been just done hours ago, probably minutes ago in the experiment. All 3 are familiar faces, but their degrees of familiarity and the kinds of familiarity you can see are actually very different. So, in the first 2 experiments, the authors contrasted the hemodynamic or the bold response to different groups of familiar faces characterized by different social and emotional attachments, as I was saying. So, in the first experiment, the authors compared the neural responses to personally familiar faces of relatives and friends versus the neural responses to faces that are familiar because of media. So, politicians, actors, singers, athletes and so on, versus, and they compared these 2 to responses to faces of strangers. In the second fMRI experiment, the authors actually recruited mothers and they measured the neural responses while they viewed pictures of their own children, familiar but unrelated children and totally unfamiliar children. Here you can see there is a very interesting contrast that will come up. Finally, in the third fMRI experiment, visual familiarity, as I was saying, was experimentally induced via behavioral training for a set of faces, and then the neural responses were recorded for visually familiar faces versus a new list of faces or novel faces. Now, the results of these experiments actually demonstrated the modulation of activity by familiarity in a distributed set of areas, including regions that have been associated with theory of mind tasks, with retrieval of episodic memory and emotional response, as well as in the features in the visual extrastriate cortex in the fusiform gyrus. So, what did they set out to do? They set out to actually evaluate whether these different kinds of familiarity that are being observed induce the neural activity differentially. And yes, they found the fact that if you just look at the three experiments, how would mothers respond to their own children versus familiar but not their own children and totally unfamiliar faces? How would you how would you respond to, say for example, pictures of Bollywood or media people versus pictures of your relatives and your family members? And lastly, how would you respond to faces that you've just become familiar with versus a new set of faces? So, these are the three kinds of familiarity that were manipulated, and indeed these three kinds of familiarity affected the way the brain responded to these pictures. So, I will talk to you in much more detail about these experiments in the next talk. Till then, goodbye.